that are affected by them.
I call David Clendon.
Mr Chair, I'm pleased to take a brief call on this bill. Firstly, to affirm the Greens' continuing support. We have supported this bill through previous readings and will continue to do so. And indeed, we will certainly support the SOP in the name of Mr Cheval. Our support for this bill was initially somewhat diffident, I have to say, a couple of years ago when it first surfaced, simply because we couldn't see that it actually would change a great deal. Our experience, our observation, the evidence was that courts, the judiciary, actually did consider an aggravating factor, in that is, if the victim of an assault was a uniformed officer, a police officer, then certainly that was deemed to be an aggravating factor, albeit it wasn't written into the law. But nevertheless, I mean, it certainly did no harm, and we're pleased to support it. As it has evolved, and particularly with reference to the SOP number 14, we think that's a particularly useful addition. It does spread out, it does extend the protection offered or the acknowledged seriousness, and like other speakers, I've personally witnessed ambulance officers being assaulted by people so drunk that they thought a person endeavouring to mend them when they'd usually suffered some injury as a result of getting involved in a punch-up in a pub, to lash out at that ambulance officer. And having up until recently had a family member who was also a volunteer ambulance person, that's clearly a matter we have to take really seriously. It's interesting, in fact, I am intrigued by the chair of the Law and Order Committee who commented earlier that certainly we have, when a number of assaults on police is measured in thousands, clearly we do have a problem here. And it does seem to me that the problem seemed to have peaked in around 2010. My understanding is that, in fact, the assaults on police, the trend is actually downward, and that's something, of course, we all could only be pleased about, and perhaps it's this latest version of 10.1, the Police Journal, the monthly magazine, talks about a more strategic approach to risk minimisation. And clearly what I consider that to be an extremely intelligent approach to policing. Not wishing to sound patronising, but just having this very, very structured framework of minimising risk to serving police officers. And as I understand it, not to pick a fight or argue numbers, but I understand that the assaults are diminishing, and that's got to be a good thing. And to the extent that the judiciary can send messages by treating the status of victims rather as an aggravating factor, that's got to be a good thing. I've already said we will very happily support Mr Cheval's bill, SOP. I just have one question, and I hope that perhaps the New Zealand First or some other person might be able to enlighten me. The supplementary order paper number 9 talks about extending this protection, if you like, or these provisions to people working in corrections, essentially police officers. It's very specific about employees of the Crown. And I just wonder in that context what this means for employees of private contractors, such as Auckland Remand Prison, people who are not employed by the Crown but by Serco, a private contractor. Does that exclude those prison officers from the provisions of this bill? Does it mean that a prison officer in Rimataka, an employee of the Crown, an assault on that person would then be an aggravating factor, but not if that person happens to be employed by Serco, albeit that they are obviously working in a very similar environment, working in an environment of equal risk. And in fact, I would argue that in a private contract prison, its likelihood is that there would be a greater risk of a prison officer being assaulted, given the characteristics of private providers and private contractors. So we're very happy to support this bill, to support the two SOPs under discussion, but I do pose that question about whether this is intended and whether in fact it would cover those who are employed by private contractors in our prison service. Kia ora.
I call Dennis O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. New Zealand First will always put the safety of our